Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston for our weekly online Ministers Forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community, and all who wish to join us online, science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Sara Terry. We'll be talking about art during this time of pandemic and during periods of social conflict and crisis. Sara is an award-winning documentary photographer, filmmaker, and journalist. She's a Guggenheim Fellow in photography and the founder and director of the Aftermath Project. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums to be a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Thank you for joining us, Sara.
Thank you.
So I thought we'd just begin kind of talking about some of the work that you've done most recently on the protests that have emerged against police brutality and white supremacy following the death of George Floyd. And I know you've been out in Los Angeles photographing at least one of the recent protests. And there's a photograph from that protest that you would like to share with us. I thought if you could just talk with us for a little while about what it's like to photograph under such circumstances and what you kind of hope to accomplish when you're out there photographing protests.
Yeah, I have been not actively on the streets with the protests. I haven't felt that my voice was needed on the streets as a photographer. There's a lot of conversation in the photographic community about encouraging editors to hire black photographers, black photo editors. So I knew that the protests in this time in America is being covered. Obviously, with the coronavirus, I've been a little careful. I was going to be seeing my elderly mother, and I didn't want to risk any exposure that could also affect her, so I had to be mindful of that. But I have been keeping my eye out. I'm trained in journalism. It's my background, but I've always tended to work on the fringes or the edges. I've tried to point the way to a story that's not being seen or reflected on things in a more layered way. And I've been working on a story in East Los Angeles, a housing story, one about housing inequity. And the community I've been working in organized a protest. It's a primarily Latino community, and they organized a protest that they had deemed family safe. One of the people in my other story had written to tell me about it. She has 2 young daughters and said, we wanted to be on the street. But she said, I've been concerned about the violence. And I thought, well, this is a protest that's not going to get a lot of coverage by the people who were out there covering, the protests with thousands of people. And it's a place I've been working. I feel authentic in covering it. And I also thought it was so important to cover a protest that was sponsored by the Hispanic community in support of Black Lives Matter. Because, historically in many places, but here in LA, groups have not, different racial groups in particular, haven't always come together to support each other. And I wanted to see this intersection of interests. And when I got there, it was amazing because it turned out to have several hundred people. But I'm getting goosebumps actually remembering it now, because on the street that day, in complete support of the message of Black Lives Matter, were African Americans, Hispanics, several generations of people, Asian Americans, indigenous people, and whites. It was one of the most, diverse things I've seen in Los Angeles in a kind of a manageable size, and I was so impressed by the way the Hispanic community was voicing its support. There was a young girl by the side of the parade that I saw. She said, I'm not black, but I will fight for your life. And it was one of the days that in all of this that gave me a lot of hope.
Well, that sounds like an amazing protest to witness, an amazing thing to witness.
It was.
I know that in Houston, I didn't go to it, but our assistant minister, Scott, went to the big city-sponsored, I mean, it's kind of hard to call a city-sponsored event a demonstration, but the city-sponsored demonstration that happened on I think it was on Tuesday, before the funeral, like about a week before the funeral, and he talked about how it was the most diverse group of people he'd ever seen, and that it sort of was like there was everybody there, and I think that that's been one thing that really does seem to be kind of unique about this moment, is that it is getting people in from, people are participating and speaking out from kind of all dimensions of society. It's people who I've never heard speak out before and seem to be kind of really, I don't know, almost taken aback by the situation, like they somehow hadn't been aware of it, or that it's just kind of opened up this whole other conversation, which has been really, really hopeful during this time when it's kind of hard to find hope.
Well, there's so much heartbreaking news, and it's so, I mean, that killing after killing after killing, and it just, you just sort of go, what, again? And then a friend of mine in New York, a photographer, wrote to me, and New York obviously has been, for quite some time, was the epicenter of the coronavirus crisis, and she wrote and said, I saw that you were out at a protest. She said, I just haven't been able, to go or wanted to. And I said, you know what, you need to. I said, I couldn't be happier, as a photographer and as an American, to have seen what I saw today, because more than anything, it reaffirmed to me the best of being an American, of our inclusiveness. I saw, in my lifetime, I haven't seen these kinds of conversations and this kind of willingness to connect. And it's like you said, that people are finally, it's like what we knew is finally struck home in our hearts. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm really glad. I keep my eye out for the fringes of things, because I think that's where I can be helpful, mm-hmm. Where my voice is perhaps a little different from a mainstream photojournalist. And I'm glad people are out there photographing, and I'm glad to see the work, and I'm most of all, thrilled that the protests are happening and seem to be ringing so true with so many people. But yeah, that protest will stay, holds a very special place in my heart that day. And now, I mean, I'm glad I did it.
So you have a lot of experience, not just photographing protests, but photographing conflict zones, social change, social turmoil, and doing this effort of going to out-of-the-way places, or places that are not getting the kind of coverage that they need to get or should be getting, and pointing the ways to stories that are not being seen. And you're particularly well known for your work in Bosnia. So I thought I'd invite you to tell us a bit about that conflict and how you came to photograph it. And also, I think for our viewers, Sarah's going to show some images now that are pretty graphic in content and depict dead bodies. They might be upsetting for you to look at. So I just wanted to offer that warning before Sarah starts to talk about this set of images here.
And I'll just say that that's a good preface. But what I will tell you is the photograph of the particularly clear image. It's a photograph of love. And what I tell people before I show the photograph is how I've come to understand it as a story of love. So I always ask people, the tendency is when I show that photo, I'll warn you when it's coming, that I tend to say, most people look away the first time, and I always say, please look again, because this is love. So I'll tell you that in a moment. And I do need to correct one thing you said, Colin, is that I don't cover conflict. Oh. I'm such a sissy. Oh. It's like the one thing I never ever wanted to cover. I don't think I have anything to add to conflict. I've just never wanted to be shot at, and I don't really want to see people killing each other. And there are plenty of photojournalists who do that. And a handful who do it really well. I had been a writer for many years, a reporter, and there came a point in my life when I had a personal crisis that caused me to lose my faith in words. For the first time in my life, words completely failed me. And I was so shocked that I wound up picking up a camera as a way of learning a different language. And when I began my first long-term project, because that was the type of photography I wanted to do, I found myself going to Bosnia. I mean, during the conflict in Bosnia, I was actually still a writer. I lived in Boston, and I was probably better informed than most people because I'm a journalist and I read, the newspapers, but it seemed very far away. And then I was reading an article in the newspaper I used to work for, the Christian Science Monitor, about the fact that more Bosnians than ever before wanted to go home, wanted to try to go home, but just as they were trying to do that, and this was a war that was marked by, ethnic cleansing, in parentheses or in quotation marks, by Serbs against Muslims. Just as people were feeling safe enough to try to go back, the international community was getting what was called Bosnia fatigue and was moving on to the next emergency zone in the world, which was East Timor at the time. Mm-hmm. And I just remember thinking how short-sighted to think that just because this was the year 2000, 5 years after the end of the war, mm-hmm. and I thought, how could that possibly be? That people could think it in 5 years after a genocide, everything should be back to normal. So 6 weeks later, I was in Bosnia on my first trip, the first of, I don't know, what became a dozen trips, trying to understand how to cover the aftermath of war. And that project is called Aftermath: Bosnia's Long Road to Peace. It took me about 5 years to do it. It came out as a book in 2005, which was the 10th anniversary of the end of the war. But I was only a year or two into the project when I realized, and this was sort of, it would have been 9/11 would have happened. All the conflict photographers were active again and going to the war zones. And I wanted it, and I was unknown in the photo world, like who knew me? And, what weight did I have or value in trying to say something? And I thought, but, to me, post-conflict is the story where we begin to define once again our humanity. It's like where you have to learn how to live again. It's where you learn how to rebuild civil societies. And it's where if you don't pay attention to resolution and reconciliation, you're burying problems that will recycle again in the future. So I was like barely into this, maybe a year or two, a five-year project. And I thought, well, if I want to get other photographers to do this, the thing that I need to do is I'll start a grant program. And we'll give a grant each year to somebody who wants to do a post-conflict story. And that's how the Aftermath Project was born. It took some time. It wasn't until 2007, I think, that we gave our first grant. But the mission of the Aftermath Project is war is only half the story. So since you've already introduced this photo or spoken about it, I'm actually going to start with it here. I'll show a couple of photos, but I want to start here because for me, having a spiritual practice, a Christian faith, it was really demanding to be working in Bosnia, again, which had this history of what has been called the worst genocide in Europe since the end of World War II. And it was trying to understand how to make photographs of that. There still are today in Bosnia exhumations of the mass graves of the victims of what was called, in quotes, ethnic cleansing, which was an attempt to destroy Bosnian Muslims. And I was friends with the forensic anthropologists who worked in the mass graves, and I was really inspired by these two people. One was Polish and one was, they're both Polish actually, one lives in Iceland. But they talked to me about how, for them, their work was about life, because in reclaiming people from mass graves, the anonymity of a mass grave and the spreading apart of bodies, in reuniting a body and then helping to be part of the identification process for families, they felt they were giving a name back to the person who'd been killed and an identity, and their families were able to find them, and so they saw it as love. I really hated the exhumation pits. As a photographer, I would look at my work and I was never close to the pits. I did not like to get close because I wrote about this in the book. It's like I hated the hatred that put people there. You know, I hated the smell. I hated everything about it, but most of all, I hated that hatred. And then one day, Eva, the lead anthropologist working in the graves, called me into a grave to take a picture for her. And it's a picture of a boy's hands that are identifiable in the grave. And I took it for her on her little Instamatic, and I nearly threw up. And I looked again, and I thought, you know what, Sarah, that's the photo you've been waiting to make. And you're going to see it here. And there's a couple of things to notice in it, because it is a photograph about love. It's about the love that Eva and Piotr have for the people who they're bringing back to life or to an identity. And if you look at Eva's hands, holding the boy's hands, there's so much love in that space. And it took me 6 months. It was actually another pretty well-known writer, Lawrence Wechsler, who did an afterword for my book, who saw that image and looked at me, and he goes, well, you do see the Sistine Chapel in this picture, don't you? Don't you see the echo of the Lord reaching out his hand to Adam and giving him life? And I was like, oh, wow. No, missped, which is odd because I have a background in fine art, and yet it was there. And you'll see it there in the picture. You see Eva's hand reaching out to this boy's and giving life to him, in the way that she can. And it was a pivotal image for me in my own work as a photographer, because I understood that while, so many people flock to cover the destruction and the hatred and the killing of war, I knew that I wanted to be in that place after the end of a war. I wanted to be in the space where human beings say to evil, you don't get the last word. You don't get to, the hatred doesn't name the day here. What you tried to do doesn't win the day, because we reassert our humanity. We bring the dead back to life, so to speak. We build love. We claim our humanity. And so for me, that's what that picture is about. And it's where I always want to stand, with the people who defy and stare down hatred and say, no, we are more than that. We are human. We love. So I hope that helps you a little bit in looking at the photograph. And I hope you see with love now. I hope you'll be able to look at photographs that are difficult and find something in them that is beyond the difficulty of what's represented, and understand the humanity that's there. I mean, that's how I work. And I'll show you this other photo from the project. It's the last photo in the book. There's a first image in the book that's of a widow who's at a reclamation site of trying to identify. It's not as clear as the first photo you saw, but the book opens with me in kind of an angry space, because I'm so mad at the world for walking away from Bosnia, and I'm saying, come on, you have to be considering it. And this is the last image in the book, and it's also influenced by my art background. It's very Magritte, and this was a commemoration day in the half of the country that has become the Serb Republic. It's a very strange peace accord that we came to in Bosnia. We sort of forced them into it in the West. But so these people are about to throw red carnations and roses into the River Drina. Some of you may know the famous novel by Ivo Andrić, Bridge on the River Drina. We're in that location in this image. And across the horizon line that you see, the hills, used to be the home for this woman and many Bosnian Muslims. And it's not safe at that point in time. I think this picture was made in 2004. It still wasn't safe for them to return. It probably still isn't today, because it's become a Serb-controlled city. But there's hope in the picture. Instead of looking down into body bags like the first widow in the book does, she's looking out to a horizon where there's the possibility of return, and it's full of color, and the red carnations, just sort of kissing the horizon line there, are about opening out to a world, and it marks my journey in the book, from that beginning anger to this sense of like, okay, I've done this story. I'm putting it out there, and by that time I knew I was starting the Aftermath project. So it's just any photographer can talk you through the journey, especially in a long-term project that's conceptual like that. But those are two that I would share with you today for thinking and and reflection on your own practice.
Well, thank you. I think that because you just mentioned it, it would probably be good now to shift to the Aftermath project, which, so what is it and why is it important to show? I mean, you've already kind of talked about it, but why are you inspired to continue to support other artists or other photographers in documenting the way that the aftermath of conflict continues?
Kind of a crazy thing to do, right? Because like I was in a conversation once about having every photographer needs a business plan, and like it came to me and they asked me what mine was, and I was like, I am not really very good with business plans. I said, I can tell you how not to do a business plan. I said, it's like, and I told them how the Aftermath project started, and I said, here I was in the middle of a project. I was, not known as a photographer at all, and I was beginning to devote myself to raising money to help other people tell post-conflict stories, which is something that I wanted to be doing, and it began there, and I wouldn't have done it any differently. I think that's part of my my work is about building conversations. I always want to be in conversation, and there was no post-conflict conversation in the photography world. There was very little actually aftermath or post-conflict discussion at all in those days. When I would talk about aftermath, people would be like, well, what do you mean by that? It's amazing to think it wasn't part of the more common or more mainstream understanding. Mm-hmm. So I wanted more I knew that photographers weren't going to get assignments to do it. They weren't going to win awards. I knew there wasn't any incentive or financial way of making it possible for most people, because I raised, I don't know, $50,000 over 7 years to be able to do, no, $70,000 to be able to go back and forth 12 times, spend weeks at a time in Bosnia, and publish a book. So like I knew what was involved in that. So I raise all the money every time. Open Society Foundations became a supporter. I've had other individual supporters, but we would give a $20,000 or a $25,000 grant every year to a photographer from anywhere in the world working on a post-conflict story. And our grant winners have ranged from contemporary conflicts in the Ukraine to historical conflicts, like the aftermath of Wounded Knee and the Lakota Indians, the Armenian genocide. We have a grant winner who recently has completed or done a project examining the spaces of the extreme, how should I say it? It's of the left and right in America around conversations around race. It's so incredibly relevant right now, especially. And the image you're going to see was by our grant winner in 2012. He did a project called American Memory. His name is Andrew Lichtenstein. You can see his work on his website and on our website. But Andrew was photographing historical places of conflict in the United States. And he was photographing them in the present. And many of those places are not recognizable or not marked by a monument. And then his text would explain to you what that place had been and what had happened there. And I love this photo, just as a photo, period. But when you know what it is, it's even more astonishing. So the three women sitting on this park bench have just walked away from the 150th rally for the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Confederacy. The picture is in Atlanta, I'm pretty sure. I might be wrong about exactly where, but they have just been celebrating the Confederacy. And they walked over to take a break, and they've sat down on the bench that, turns out to be the bench at the bus stop where Rosa Parks got on the bus and helped launch the civil rights era. So it's like, the whole idea of the layers of history and what rests underneath, and what isn't dealt with or grappled with, and what aftermaths continue. I mean, the Aftermath Project recognizes that aftermaths go on, from 5 minutes later to a year later to generations later. So it's just they're more thoughtful spaces. I think they're quieter spaces. They're more conceptual spaces where you can just really spend time. And our website's got all of our grant winners and the finalists and several lesson plans. And we've done books for anybody who wants to look into that a little bit more.
Wow. I mean, it is a very powerful image, and to know that, to think about viewing it in 2020, when they're sitting where they're sitting, and at that particular moment, which
2012,
was in the middle of...
it's like you think about it in 2020 and go, whoa, this was 8 years ago.
Well, right. It's 8 years ago, and it's also in the middle of President Obama's presidency.
Exactly.
But right around, getting ready for that re-election. I mean, it's got an incredible amount of resonance, and really, I think, shows a thing that is just very true, which is this conflict of the Civil War, which was a conflict over slavery and over white supremacy, continues to shape the United States, and in many ways is continuing to, is not over, right? The conflict
it's not over at all.
Has not had its resolution, I mean, like, whatever that resolution is going to be, we could talk about that at a different point, but in terms of it's very much continuing and continues in so many different ways all of the time.
Which to me also, especially you all in Texas, in a way that, blew my mind. I might have learned about it through Andrew's project, Juneteenth. I mean, like, 2 years after they've been freed, slaves in Texas got the news. You all have a whole other story.
Well, and actually, I mean, this is kind of a footnote here, but the thing that's fascinating about the conversation around Juneteenth is that isn't actually even the end of slavery in the United States. And I'm not even talking about how people could be forced into convict labor after the end of, slavery, after the Emancipation Proclamation and the
13th
14th,
Amendment
15th.
Allows for slavery and
right.
incarceration.
Right. So, after those three Reconstruction era amendments, but there were a number of people who were still enslaved in the border states that had continued to fight for the Union during the Civil War up through the end of 1865, because the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the Confederacy. It didn't free slaves in the Union, right? And
I know, right? It's like, what?
So that didn't even happen for another 6 months or something like that. I mean, I'd have to actually look up the right date, but it was in
that time span. Yeah,
right.
That delayed time span. It's insane. But what you're seeing today, right now, is the aftermath of that. It's the aftermath of 1619. It's the aftermath of predatory capitalism. It's the aftermath of our inability to acknowledge systemic racism and systemic inequity. And that's all coming to the foreground right now, which is also part of why I'm so hopeful. Aftermath, it's finally here for a reckoning, even if that takes forever. And I some of my black friends, are kind of like, yeah, we'll see. They're not convinced, about the change happening. And I appreciate that and understand it. In my own experience, I'm like, I really feel like we're ready to sit down at the table. We've got to.
Well, I mean, I think that this is now at least the third time this country has now had an opportunity to sort of really try to deal with its systematic racism and white supremacy. And so... I mean, I am somebody who shares some of that skepticism. I mean, I'm not unhopeful in this moment, but I do share some of that skepticism.
I understand it. I'm just kind of like wildly optimistic in general. So I if anybody wants to be less than optimistic, I'm like, I'm good with that. I understand why you are.
Well, I mean, I think for me, and I actually talked a bit about this on Sunday. I mean, I think for me, the thing is not so much like, okay, so everybody feels like this is really the moment. Well, how do we carry this moment forward into our actions like 20 years from now? Not going out. I mean, like, how do we take the protests and really change them, shift them into institutional change?
Yeah.
and personal change. And I think that that's the real question. So we're moving towards the end of this, and I want to make sure that we have time to talk about why I originally asked you to be our guest, which is your new pandemic work that you've been doing. Because you have a couple of different projects related to how people, friends and family, are adjusting to life during this time of global crisis, global health crisis. So could you tell us a bit about those projects and how that work relates to your faith, which you've touched on sort of throughout this conversation, but I thought I'd give you a chance at the end to really specifically talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many dimensions to the pandemic and to the suffering that it's caused and the loss of life and the heroism of essential workers. In my own little world, think about what it's like to be a photographer who can't photograph. It's like it presented me with like who also didn't want to go out. Like I didn't, I had friends in New York who were out, but I was like, no, I don't want to do that. And in LA, you don't really see the pandemic. There was still traffic on the freeways. The parking lots at the grocery stores were crowded. I wasn't like my friends in Manhattan who would be out, like walking on the street and going past morgue trucks, so it began in that space, and it's both these things it's from a project called Notes from the Pandemic, and the first one is called These Days, and it was a lot of, it's all in my neighborhood, and there's several kind of memoir type writings I do with them. And this one you're going to see is image number 3 from that project. I think I don't know if I've even put these on my website yet, but I've read the diary entry that goes with it. These Days, 3, Between the Rains, March 20th, 2020. It's been pouring in Los Angeles, off and on for days. To my mind, the rain started coming right around the time the coronavirus started becoming a topic of daily conversation here. Every time a new burst of showers starts tapping on my roof, I can't help but think about things being cleansed and about the constant number one reminder to everyone, everywhere, to wash their hands. A photographer friend of mine in Jordan emailed me the other day from her home in Amman, where the government has told residents to stay inside. She spoke of things she'd read about the pandemic being a result of humans' massive interference with the earth and its ecosystems. Sitting at home right now, looking through the window, streets are empty, she wrote. For the past few days, it's raining and thunderstorms, and I wonder if it's Mother Nature taking matters in its own hands, washing away everything, protecting us again. Once again, I say it all fits in. As we wait for the aftermath of all this, I can't help but be hopeful that at the end, like after a fire, the land will live to produce again. There was a short, sharp outburst of rain yesterday, and when I came out of my studio into the garden, the sun was shining brilliantly, everything green and bright and wet. I think my friend, Nadia Besesio, is right that the land and that we humans will live to produce again. Happy first day of spring, Nadia, from Los Angeles to Amman. During this period of time for like about 5 or 6 weeks, I love cooking and baking, and I baked sort of every Sunday afternoon after church. I would bake a cake, and I would open up my studio door, which is a big sliding glass garage door, and I would put cake out in the driveway and invite people. It was all wrapped carefully, and I had hand sanitizer, and I would invite people to take something if they wanted, and I would deliver it to people who were too concerned to go out. And then after like that period of time, it was very typical of me. I was like, no, I'm done with that now. That was what I needed to do. It was part of my way of processing what I was dealing with. And then the second one really grew out of not being able to imagine the world that was out there. I mean, I've had 40 years of being a journalist in which the way I understand what's happening in the world is I'm there, either in the breaking news moment or in the aftermath of it. And I didn't know what New York looked like. I didn't know what, cities I've been to and places I've loved look like. So I began exploring the world through, I went down this really big rabbit hole of live cams. I found dozens and dozens of live cam feeds from all over the world, from Tokyo, from Kathmandu. There's an amazing coral reef aquarium that I fell in love with. I was looking at places, empty spaces in Spain, in Times Square, Dealey Plaza in Dallas. There are cameras out there, and everything was empty. There was almost nobody there. And so that project, I didn't know why I was obsessing on it. I probably did more than 1,000. I wound up calling them photographs, not screenshots, because I'm choosing the moment when I'm hitting, the screenshot button on my laptop. And I realized that the project is called, it's called Not, in parentheses, Not Being There, because being there is what I've always been. And I'm just in the final edit of that. There's 4 pictures here. It is a wind farm in Antarctica. Kathmandu. Times Square. And the aquarium I mentioned that I've loved so much. It'll probably be 40 to 50 pictures when that edit's finished. And it's funny because I finished it right before Floyd George was murdered. And so I just haven't offered it anywhere. It's not appropriate. It's not a moment of now. But it's a space those places will never, ever look that way again. I documented, a time in the history of the world, and it's a global project that speaks to like an awful lot of things that I'm still figuring out, and and they all come from all my work comes from my contemplation and my practice, and a constant desire to understand the ego that I believe is our creator, and what that means to be a creative person within that creation. I always feel that creative people are kind of the closest to God, because the first way we know him in the first chapter of Genesis is as a creator. And the trick for me is to remind myself that I'm not responsible for creation. Everything I do is in a response to the creation that our father, mother, has done. So sometimes I'm rebelling against what I see humanly and saying that's not the way it can be, that's not the way it is, that needs to change. Sometimes I'm right in harmony with it, with thanks. And it's not something I discuss a lot with people. When you asked and said this was for a church, I knew I felt I needed to just talk about faith and practice, and you've seen some of the ways I've done that today. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. We very much appreciate your willingness to come talk to us, and the opportunity you've given us to look at these images and to talk through them and to learn about your creative process and approach to the world and to art and to creating. And I think I very, very much appreciate it. So thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thanks for making the space.
Absolutely. And for those of you who are viewing Sara's work, some of Sara's work will be featured again in Sunday's service for our visual meditation, so we're very excited about that. And if you found this video to be helpful, I hope you'll consider joining us for that weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central Daylight Time. Features music and prayers in addition to a sermon. This week, like I said, we'll be featuring some of Sara's work alongside, in addition, there'll be also a special prayer honoring Pride. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. We'll see you all online soon and in person as soon as possible for us to gather again. Please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we're all in this together.